name is Timur. I'm a research fellow at the Open Technology Institute, which is part of the New American Foundation based in Washington, D.C. For anybody who still feels very much in the food coma, that's what this green map is for, so let's take advantage of it. We're here today because, as you are well aware, since the Arab Spring, we've become a lot more aware of technology that's being exported by Western companies to countries such as Libya, Syria, and Bahrain, to end users that have used this technology for human rights abuses, and it's dual-use technology that has been used for surveillance and monitoring. So this is a new problem that we all face and that we are trying to grapple with. And the buzzwords in terms of companies are obviously Blue Code, Gamma, Kingfisher, and the Citizen Lab has done some excellent research in terms of hacking team and trying to parse out what technology are we talking about, what countries are we talking about. And we at OTI have been looking at the policy menu that's available to address this, specifically export control being one of the policy options that might want to pursue, and we agree that through a joint project with Privacy International and Digitale Gesellschaft, with Ben Wagner, who's here, being part of that as well. And just to get everybody on the same page and make sure that we're not talking about different things, what are export controls? They are not sanctions. Currently the US has 5 sanctions regimes in place that are comprehensive sanctions against Syria, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, and Cuba. So those are separate from the export controls that we'll be discussing today. The export controls that we'll be discussing are the worldwide regime covering all countries that are not a ban per se, but that is a elaborate regime in terms of reviewing exports to specific countries with licensing policies in place for specific technologies that might require the exporter to apply for a license or at least notify the government that this technology is being exported to that country. Final point of this introductory remarks is in December 2013, the Bosnia Arrangement, which is a multilateral export control regime focused on, among others, dual-use technology, apparently consists of 41 member states, announced new export controls relating to intrusion software and IP network surveillance systems. And we handed out the actual language, which is the handout that you have on your chairs, in case the discussion gets into the weeds of that we have it in your hand, if you want to. The controls were agreed on by those member states. They now need to be implemented in each of those 41 countries. You have some countries that aren't formally part of the Bosnia regime, but that usually take it as a reference, Israel, China to a certain extent. And this process is now underway in the US, with the US government looking into how to actually integrate these new controls within the US export control regime, which is something that we're looking into, as well as something that the 3 gentlemen to my right have been thinking about. And with that, I'm going to introduce Danny O'Brien, who's the International Director at EFF, that I believe everybody knows, so it doesn't need further introduction. Colin, unless you want me to tell about his time at the Committee to Protect Journalists for 3 years before he rejoined EFF, where he was working a lot on outreach. He's been spending 15 years on privacy and has a wealth of experience that he will bring to the table today, being the moderator between Colin Anderson, who's an independent researcher, and as we've already heard, is doing a lot of research on Iran, and so it's some really interesting empirical research that I encourage everybody to look at. And then we have Fukami, who is from Germany and a member of the Chaos Computer Club. He's an IT security advisor to a company called Section 1, Section 1. And he's here to argue with healthy skepticism and against export controls. And Colin, in this discussion round, will present views on why this might be a viable policy option. And with that, I'll hand it over to Danny.
I really like, a friend of mine who was not a geek once described geek conversations as being fact tennis. Which basically, rather than talking about the weather or anything, one person would go, I have a fact. And then the second person would go, I too have a fact that is connected to your fact. And they would just communicate and tie into facts. And the point where somebody lost was the point where somebody said, I no longer have any more facts. and that was like the dropped ball, and that was fat tennis, and it was 15 love. So I would actually like to see if we can keep an incredibly extended volley of fat tennis going here. In that I think that this is a discussion that is only just beginning, and I think that for a very long time it was highly theoretical. Many people had very theoretical concerns about the dangers of technology being used for surveillance and intrusion, and other people had very theoretical, principled objections about what a world would be like if we were obliged to regulate or control software. And then it became very practical all of a sudden. We knew that intrusion and surveillance was going on, and as Tim said, we're now in a situation where people running export controls are actually attempting to solve this problem and produce language. So part of the history of this, and I think this is why I'm here, is so who here knows pretty well the crypto wars as a term? Okay, so so it's worth still spelling, because I think without an understanding of the history of the crypto wars, it's hard to understand why this would even be a controversial issue to discuss. It seems like most of the language and rhetoric that you would see in public consumption about the idea that we have intrusion and surveillance software that is being sold to bad actors by companies who, as far as in many cases we're aware that they know that this is being used for human rights abuses by known human rights abusers. Why would you not place export controls to limit or regulate this kind of trade? And I think one of the reasons why many people in the technical community are concerned about this is because of two things. One, many years ago in the 90s, this was a very fierce battleground over attempts by, in particular, the US government to control, for all intents and purposes, general purpose computation, the export of encryption, which, as we all now know, and everybody who was involved in this debate on one side knew at the time, is an incredibly powerful tool for use by individuals to fight off surveillance and protect privacy. The particular and peculiar conditions of that time meant that there was a very concerted attempt by the US government to regulate not just technology, but algorithms, software, equations, effectively, to the point where people were tattooing the equations that underlie public key cryptography as a statement to point out that, like, I'm walking through customs and you viewing my tattoo as an ammunition, as an armament. So that battle was, and we've had debates here before, was won. And it was won by making the argument that code is speech, that this is actually a free speech issue, that you cannot legislate to control the communication of an idea, the communication, even if it's expressed in software, because that's a limitation on freedom of expression as well as being very impractical. So, having described that thing that happened many years ago, and just set the context for this debate, I also want to emphasize that this is, in many ways, a very different discussion. The encryption debate still continues. There are still export controls on encryption. There has been a parallel discussion that's gone on about the regulation of the market for exploits or 0 days, which do have many characteristics similar to this, in that they're code and have some of the issues. But this is a different debate. We're talking about specifically the regulation of intrusion software, and we're talking about the regulation of surveillance software and hardware. But I totally understand if that seems a very nice difference, and I think we're going to explore what those differences are in this conversation. So that's the background context. I would like to make sure that anyone can chip in on this. We're in a round table, and I think there's as much expertise out in the people not on white chairs than there is on the people on white chairs. Simply in Tim's little finger, practically. But I would like to sort of direct the questions and then maybe we can open it up. So Colin, because of your background as a prominent researcher, as a Iranian researcher, what is the problem that you think these export controls are seeking to solve? Both the problems that you might see and maybe also the problems that the governments that have proposed this language see.
Well, so I think that, and that was an excellent introduction that touched on a lot of the issues. What you've seen over the past decade is both a theoretical and a real conversation about the relationship between governments and the control of technologies and the provision of services to potentially repressive governments. This is no more sort of tangible than in the case of the Global Online Freedom Act, that had whose general theme was to start to mitigate these stories about companies like Yahoo collaborating with the Chinese state in order to reveal the identity of pseudonymous or anonymous activists. So we had that fundamental tension, and that was at the core, especially a decade ago, the tension that was making the news, which is that we have potential moral but no legal liabilities when it comes to collaborating with regimes with substantial human rights abuses and a complete absence of rule of law. What we saw was, I think, a shift in priorities, in part because civil society, this is as much about civil society's ability to leverage accountability as it is governments. In the case of companies such as Google and Yahoo, we were able, civil society organizations such as yours primarily, was able to inflict so much damage to the legitimacy of these companies that they were forced to, at least on the face, begin to have conversations about what is the role of human rights in their operations. That's why you have organizations such as the Global Network Initiative. And this is why you have things like audits. These are potentially and often flawed processes, but there are processes that were put into place based off of civil society's ability to force a conversation on these companies. What you've seen primarily, or largely in the case of the companies that provide surveillance technologies, is that there is very little sort of touchstone to enforce that sort of accountability. So if you look like at a company like Hacking Team or Gamma, how do you have a consumer-facing boycott? In fact, if you look at this, for example, these companies act with behaviors that have no other characteristic than malfeasance. And I think that we agree on this primarily. This is not a conversation about the duplicity of the companies. We agree on that. This is a conversation about the mechanisms of enforcement and potentially even legal punitive mechanisms. So the encryption debate comes into this conversation because of old scars and because of also steps by the UK Export Control Organization that these were steps that were made in good faith but were clumsy. And so in the case of Gamma, you saw that they attempted to control FinFisher based off of encryption restrictions. Encryption is still controlled. Let's not forget that. Encryption is still controlled.
In the US, not that much like other.
Yeah. So I'm going to exercise, I think, the privilege of talking from a U.S. standpoint. Because in fact,
Fine privilege, the greatest privilege of all. I think.
I say privilege because I think that there's going to be a lot of instances where we talk about where there is a fundamental and meaningful difference in implementation, or rather in cases of implementation. And we can take a lot of US examples that I think are more developed than the European examples. And so definitely it's important to introduce that nationality into that, because I think we agree that the EU's restrictions or openings, exemptions, are not as open as the United States, and that absolutely is a point of opportunity for civil society and to push on greater relaxation of encryption both in the United States and Europe. We have no doubt about that.
But this was the UK using encryption restrictions.
Yes, yeah, and in all cases, there is still restrictions on the provision of encryption specifically to governments. And so that was exercised. So we have to say malfeasance based off of the reaction of these companies. What was the reaction of Gamma to that control? For one, they started to move their legal liabilities out of companies or countries where they would potentially be controlled. But they removed encryption. And so when the UK government attempted to control based on encryption, they just said, fine, we're going to put an unencrypted product out there. That's malfeasance. And that's malfeasance that we have no interaction with. And I want to make one point, and then I'll sort of hand it back, is that what we've had since then, because we have no ability to sort of reach into this legally, morally, as consumers, we've fought, or we've struggled. And so we've had, for example, lawsuits like the EFF. The problem is that the legal standing for taking up claims against foreign countries and foreign activities in the United States has only been diminished by recent cases having to do with the Alien Tort Statute. And so if you look at the EFF case with regard to Ethiopia and Hacking Team is such a small subset. That doesn't fix the problem. That just says, as long as you have standing, as long as you have somebody to sue within the United States, and as long as the victim of these human rights violations is in the United States, this is the only thing you can control for legally. And so we have fundamentally no mechanisms in which to coerce legally or economically companies into behaviors that respect fundamental human rights. And so this is the issue that we're struggling with.
So I'm still going to wear my moderator hat here, so I want to go, no, actually, and throw in
We have very few. We attempt to assert know your customer policies, but what does Hacking Team care about knowing its customer?
But, so, let's try and fill in the gaps here. So, people understand the background of the Gamma case. We've got a general, okay, great. So I guess, we'll talk a little bit more about what tools we have to control this debate.
Sure.
I want to introduce Gami and let you explain a little bit about the concerns that I think many in the technical community have about this specific way of controlling these kinds of uses.
Okay, first of all, just another detail about myself. I'm doing practical security, which means I'm attacking for money, like governments, banks, whatever. So I see a lot of real life security or insecurity. So and it is itself a challenging but very interesting job. And what we rely on is stuff which is regulated inside this part about intrusion software, because what we do is we intrude. And my concern is basically two things. One thing is the whole discussion was about controlling software and technology for surveillance, but what we actually end up with is an exploit regulations and not real control on surveillance technology. Because for one, if you look at the definitions, it's a very, very good definition of what an exploit actually is. Although the people from PI and other people told me, we take care that we don't have exploit regulations inside Wassenaar. What is the problem? The problem is Wassenaar is basically a weapon controls regulation, which means it controls lethal weapons, proliferation, and other means of dangerous technology. Exploits are something which we need to understand computation. Without exploits, we don't understand what the side effects of computation are. And without exploits, we are not able to do our job. The other thing is, there's another part about the IP network surveillance systems. This is even more interesting because on one hand, this exact technology is mandatory for every telco doing business in all of the Western countries. So the interesting thing is that we try to regulate export and declare something, a dangerous technology, which is mandatory for all of our communication. And this, this shows, in my point, very, very clearly that this whole policy is completely over. In terms of, it shows that, there was this nice expression from this gentleman saying, if you have something inside controls which you use yourself, you should think. And that's exactly what we see with the export regulations on this technology. And the fun part is that the whole definition of the IP surveillance system stuff says, okay, it doesn't apply to marketing software, which, as a technologist and as someone who really closely read all the papers of Snowden and so, it shows that they actually use those software for surveillance and for targeting people. So this is, there are several things inside this regulations which are simply either stupid or even dangerous. And the dangerous part is, I forgot to mention that, the chilling effect you have on people producing exploits. We, for example, refuse to release exploits anymore because it's much too dangerous to get somehow involved in some cases where some stupid guy from somewhere uses these exploits in certain ways, and also we refuse to work with in countries outside Wassenaar because what we offer is exploitation services for telcos, for example, not services. We use exploits to show vulnerabilities inside their infrastructure, but we don't know what is going to happen there. So we are on the way to don't work with those countries anymore, just for don't get into trouble. We don't have the people to help us in those cases, and we don't. We are not lawyers, we are hackers. So
I want to just ask a quick question, which is, do you think, is this an objection that you have to this particular language, or do you think that it's actually impossible to write an export control that wouldn't have these chilling effects or this sort of general prohibition on use of tools?
So in general, I'm not against weapon controls and proliferation things. But I'm strictly against ways of controlling general technology and regulating execution of code is something which is not going to be in a well place if we talk about weapon controls. And I mean, I have another nice example why especially Wassenaar is a big problem. I know a couple of people who offer technology for encryption, especially hardened phones. During the last couple of weeks, they tried to export the stuff to Ukraine. And since it takes a while to get the proper papers for that, the people in Ukraine simply didn't get those phones. So if anybody is telling me that this is helping someone, I don't know. I don't think so, especially if it comes to those corner cases where it's not about weapons, but about other means. And if you really look closely to the Wassenaar arrangements, there's lots and lots of those weird things inside it. For example, for specific computation things where they say you're not allowed to export stuff with a certain ability, if it can do more than...
So your critique is that this is always going to be too broad, right?
Yeah.
So Colin, you get to reply to this because...
But what I'm saying is since the release, there's been a consistent mischaracterization of both the controls and the process. Wassenaar is not just a munitions list. In fact, it's a dual-use items list in its name. And so in its name, as an arrangement, it concedes this exact point, that there is a subset of technologies that has both a utility for good and a utility for bad. If the view of it
There's
is
no exception. I mean, like, that was used to be the control list for the Cold War.
Mhm.
So it was not just, you know, that's a very, very important detail in my point of view, because it shows where it comes from.
Sure. It comes from the fact that there is the acknowledgement that there are dangerous, that there are technologies that could be employed for dangerous purposes. No one disputes that. But the arrangement is designed in order to deal with these potential dual-use issues. If this was viewed as a munition, it would be on a munitions list. There is a munitions list that is administered under the State Department, but the proposal is in the Commerce Control List. And so, in fact, we do regulate code. We regulate actually a lot of code. We do still regulate encryption. And in the case of the United States, encryption regulations is not a substantial issue in the case as the issue that you pointed out. This is, in fact, I think, an articulation for engaging with the process and dealing with these issues. We regulate a whole lot of code. In fact, this is not just the first step into regulating surveillance technology. Last year, there was regulations that covered MC catchers, which is mobile phone trackers. And in fact, if you look at the structure of this, you have things like the general software availability node. And so this is how we know, for example, that Metasploit, which is a tool that I think the both of us use quite often, which is an open source exploitation framework. So this was something that would be covered on the general software node.
So just to be clear, what the general software node says that because this is
generally available to the public, either commercially or likely non-commercially, over the internet in store, or is in the public domain, it would therefore fall outside of the Boston arrangement. So this is what you see within the structure of this dual use list, is you see a narrowing of the cases. In fact, what I think is interesting is that in the case of you talked about advertising, this is articulation. This does not negate the process. This is a reason why you should be involved with the process. You can't say that this is the wrong way about going it because it's imperfect.
But it's not just imperfect. It's like really, it is so clearly,
But that's actually, so you actually talk about some of these technologies. The reporting on this, and I think your encapsulation of this, is to take, so there's a definition of intrusion software, and this is, everyone should have the sheet. If you, the control is, this definition of intrusion software is a technical term. The control is not around actually intrusion software. This was something that came up even because people were concerned of if you got owned and you crossed a border, you might be committing a sanctions violation because your computer is malware unintentionally. That's a legitimate concern. What this is, and I think that we actually also again agree on maybe avoiding the militarization of the internet and using a language that promotes a militarization of the internet. But what this language is it's about the weaponization of exploitation. The weaponization of exploitation that is for a narrow amount of consumers at a significant amount of service level. And so when you start to take in what Wassenaar is, and when you start to participate, what you find is, in fact, that this definition, if it has a fault, might in fact be too narrow. This is not a war on general purpose computation. This is a war on a very specific subset of very tailored, specially designed surveillance kits.
So here's something that seems to be a potential risk here. So the company is saying that that anything you write in this form, which is a control of software, let's just constrain it down to software for argument's sake here, as an export control is going to catch, is going to be too broad. You already noted that there's some elements of this are too narrow. Is this actually going to be effective in either of these cases? Isn't it? This is certainly the concern that lawyers at the EFF frequently have. That if you create controls on technology where technology is defined as a range of things which are incredibly fluid, right? You know, it's entirely possible, as we were saying earlier, for Tim Fisher to suddenly go, okay, we're going to declare our software to be a special marketing form of surveillance, right? And it's the same software, it's just you've renamed the labels. They can make it generally available, right? God knows there's enough spyware and censorware being used that, in other countries, which is actually the weaponization of filterware that's used in schools and libraries, or keyloggers that are used to tap people's children, right? It's the same thing. Do you not run into the problem here that the only thing that you're going to create here is potential collateral damage because it'll never actually catch the bad guy?
Well, in fact, Wuhan announced that they felt that they were subject to the Wassenaar changes and would be making changes to their business model based off of this language. So immediately,
I can tell you what they do in the future.
Yes, but that's
kind because they're saying zero-day vulnerabilities that in of themselves are simply flaws. They're not actually weaponized yet. Right? So how is their business model threatened by Wassenaar?
The interesting thing is,
let's get Comment to answer it then.
Because that then opens up a whole lot of other questions. How have they changed it? How do they do that? How has it changed their business model? Because I think that's a really important way of understanding this.
Well, I think it was specific to Wuhan. All they announced is they felt that they were covered by Wassenaar. These are companies that, by their business model, are opaque in the way that they do operations. If you force them into being generally available, then this is a fundamental
right, okay.
Not because of the nature of what they're selling, but because their software is not generally available.
Because there's not, well, both. It would be a combination of both. But to speak to both of these points, what you're talking about is them fundamentally changing their business model. And so this is a business model that thrives on opacity. Selling malware and having weaponized malware is about exclusivity. It's about a significant business relationship. We aren't talking about the business model of Gamma is not selling it like Dart.com is selling, which is a PayPal account that you cleared at. It's about a service model that is exclusive. When you buy Gamma, Spin Fisher products or Hacking Team products, you're not just buying something that can exploit. You're buying a near guarantee that somebody is going to be exploited. That is not something that translates very well. And in fact, that would, by definition, fall outside of the Wassenaar's general availability now.
I can just add a point on Wuhan. I think that, and a note of caution, because I think it's also interesting that we are right now still in the process of these new controls being implemented. So de facto, they're actually yet to be implemented in the export control regime. Right. So if a company comes out and already takes a certain position on this, there's some politics involved in the US government right now trying to figure out how to actually implement those controls. So if you issue a certain statement, you already influence that process in and of itself. So to what degree that is captured by or not, we don't know, because right now the implementation process is in the process of being worked out. So
and Wuhan was saying they were willing to, or they felt to
It's their understanding.
Yeah.
the interesting thing with that is that we already talked a little bit about the business model behind surveillance, and we completely agree about companies like Gamma and Hacking Team in terms we don't like their business. I don't like it at all. But especially Wuhan is a little bit a different case because it shows where the real like this business is working, which infected us much more than those with the export controls. Because what they sell is actually not weaponized exploits, it's just vulnerabilities to those services, to those agencies which can weaponize them on their own behalf, like the NSA, like GHQ. So the interesting thing is, if Wassenaar would cover that as well, we have an even funnier problem because the knowledge about vulnerability it's like funny and a very interesting legal aspect of like IP in terms of who owns the vulnerability. Is it the person who wrote the vulnerable code because like he produced the code? So in the normal means, it would we would say it's owned by the vulnerable, like
Microsoft
for example, yeah. But but it's not his intention, so we cannot really claim IP for that. So that's at least the case we have right now. If it comes to exploitation in terms of export controls, so the question is how would you regulate an idea? Because it's basically telling something, and we had this nice discussion a couple of minutes ago, what it actually means. If you look to vulnerabilities that they exploit, for example, there is an example of an exploit from, or like a vulnerability from Wupen. It's all about one character, which was like wrong. To get full like exploitation on this machine without any big stuff we have to do. So this is basically something which you cannot regulate in a simple and meaningful way. Moreover, if you start to regulate that, it can become very, very dangerous for security.
So,
That's an example. I'm from Germany, so we have a law called the so-called hacker tools law, which is all about that you are not allowed to distribute or use tools for which are meant to be attack tools. The problem with that is that people need to use their tools to prove their own security. Those tools are all attack tools. There is no defensive tool and only for defensive means. That doesn't simply exist. So people are not releasing their code on specific like tests, just for saying, okay, there's a law which forbids me to release that. And people who need to use those tools say, okay, this says something, I'm not allowed to do that, so I'm not doing it, and I'm not able to take care about my security. So even though nobody got ever convicted because of that paragraph, it has a real effect on and a negative effect on real life security. And that's the basic thing you have with all those type of regulation, where it comes to regulating parts where most of the time you have a good use.
So I wanted to try and bring this down into sort of particularly practical concerns. I mean, one of the issues here is we know that unlike the crypto wars, we know that the intention here is to stop bad people using this software for bad purposes, right? That's the specific intent. And what we're sort of arguing about here is the mapping between those two things. Are we going to catch good people using the software for good purposes? Well, work out the entire matrix, but we're trying to limit it, and we're trying to limit it in a particular way. I know that at EFF, one of our concerns about these kinds of rules in particular is because many of the good actors, like security researchers, like people trying, for instance, to break controls on their own device to reassert some control, those people are often framed or perceived by governments as actually being bad actors, right? I think that definitely much of the concern that's gone on here has been listening to politicians and civil society sort of talking about these things in very general terms, and a legitimate concern by people who have been caught up by this in the past that they will be pillarized or targeted in this way simply because governments don't understand that the people fighting to protect this software, break this software. You've been involved in systems times where like infiltrating data from Syrian systems has been something. It's not been, so I'm not. This is not. I said involved in a vague sort of like a community analyzing this data.
Would you like to put the camera towards the window for a second?
And some of the analysis. Let me self-incriminate. Some of the analysis that EFF did with Citizen Map, we're dealing with moving data across borders, We're dealing with independent security researchers. We're dealing with exactly this kind of like traffic that goes on. I mean, my concern looking at this is that actually this is trying to create a black and white line where actually the people who are most vulnerable are the people who are in these gray areas. Is this a sort of good summary of the concern? I mean, how do you reassure people that this isn't going to be misused, particularly when, you know, signatories to the Wassenaar Arrangement include Israel and China, right? Or adopters of the Wassenaar language. Okay, that's often they.
But the French are part of it, and the French are really bad in
I can agree with you there. Yes, that's something, you know, almost Europe-wide. But this could be taken and misused. But you're confident that the language will protect it from being misused in that way.
I'm confident that participation by civil society and people who have these concerns and have the ability and willingness to interrogate the document is the only means of interacting with a process that is going on right now and has already been adopted within the Wassenaar Arrangement. I think that there is a different conversation between our old battle wounds and an actual legal text. And I think that we come into these things with legitimate concerns, but these legitimate concerns are different from a textual analysis based off of the law. And when we start to look at things like jailbreaking and antivirus that has been expressed as concerns in public posts and in our conversation, it's very clear that within the law, the way that it exists, or rather within the recommendations and within the implementations, it'll be more clear. These things are not covered. And so we have to engage in this process directly and within a legalistic framework and a legalistic discourse, rather than coming into it and just saying, I don't feel good about any governmental regulation, which is what we've been doing. We've been expressing emotions versus expressing specific points of contention. And so if, for example, the word generation is inaccurate or overbroad, then we need to be able to offer a different word other than generation in, specifically for to that effect. That's when we have been successful in engaging with these processes, which we haven't done.
Right, but this language was not created by civil society, and this process is opaque to civil society.
I don't think it's true. I don't think that civil society has engaged in the mechanisms that exist. There are technical advisory committees. There are open solicitations for responses. There are legislative means that exist. And by and large, there has been not a direct participation in the venues that exist for industry and for everyone else. And there are recommendations of furthering that. We should be saying what the form of control is, because there are different levels of control even. There is a control that is an absolute embargo on the export, and then there are controls that are just, send an email once every year to this email address. There's a wide range of controls, and we aren't having a conversation even about that. And so if we don't have that conversation, then we don't have any involvement in the process. And this is why we have had no relationship with the end link.
Okay,
I think now I should run a stack. So, I
always get the same argument, that those concerns are not, not tied to the language here. But laws are always not just what they said. They have a much broader effect on how people behave, what people think they are, and more specifically. In my point of view, that's the first step to declare the export weapons. And that's simply like that, because I've been in lots of discussions and in lots of sessions where it was all about export controls, or at least it was some part of it was about export controls, and it was all about digital weapons. And for me, this is something really, really weird. I mean, in my point of view, there is nothing like a digital weapon, or if we have something like a digital weapon, it's big data. That's the only weapon we have to talk about in a digital mean, in my point of view. But all, it's human rights don't they're not tied to the change of a library running on the system. That's not, that's not we're gonna have the right discussions and the right policies. What we in the moment, or what this is actually, what this actually is like making the business of a couple of companies much harder. It doesn't mean that they don't have business anymore. In my point of view, it's even the opposite, because having this means a lot of very, very good possibilities to make a lot of money. I mean, that's basically it, just by having a market which works much more towards we don't talk about it or we just go directly to companies to countries and build companies over there. So we don't need to talk about controls at all. So for those companies, it's actually very nice to have those things, as long as they don't care about their public standing.
So that they have the resources to reach over this sort of regulation.
And if you really look to those cases, there are two things which I find really interesting. One thing is, and you can comment on that, but I think I'm right. Those exploits we are talking about, they are not then most of the time nothing else than off-the-shelf exploits. It's not that it's very sophisticated. So that means that those people get exploited anyway, or they are already exploited. It's just another player exploited them. It's not that they are high-value targets that get targeted by zero days. Usually they get attacked by vulnerabilities that are years old. That's at least from my experience. And on the other hand, it doesn't really do anything about the business.
So let's we can throw this. How much time have we got now?
20 minutes.
Oh, okay, fine. Great. Okay, so this seems to be a good way of opening things up. So I see you then. Do you still got your hand?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go this way, and then Tim, because you've already spoken before, and then you've already spoken before, so we're full to one.
I mean, so part of the reason I presume why there's so much focus being put on export controls is that there seems to be very little avenues, very few avenues to influence and prevent companies from acting, in a way which is intended to violate human rights. So, what you're coming up against here is a complete lack of regulation of international corporations. People in Ethiopia are experiencing what people in the Ogoni people in Nigeria have seen, or trade unionists in Argentina who, were mistaken to have complicit in violations against them. So my question is what other avenues are there available to try and prevent this from happening? Because, in the absence of anything else, and it seems right to focus on this, it is inadequate at this
I
point.
have a couple of things to say to that. Yeah,
Sure.
my answer to that is actually what the Snowden showed us is that we live in an incredible, insecure technical world. So the means we need to fight surveillance is basically getting more secure technology. And in my point of view, there are policies thinkable which are specifically help not only us but also people in other countries. Which means if I have software liabilities, if I have warranties, which we don't have with software at the moment. Sorry to take that example again. There are only two types of businesses where you don't have real liabilities, and you are called a user. That's the software industry and drug trade. So that's the places where you don't where you can't expect to get what you expect. And with software it's the same thing. You don't get what you expect. You just get something running on your machine, but most of the time it's incredible and vulnerable. So we have to have that part much more, be able to think about that. That's the most important part at all.
But I think the problem is that despite me bringing up Wupen, there is no evidence, and I don't know why Wupen made its decision, but there is no evidence within this that exploits are being proposed to be regulated. There's no vulnerability, there's no indication that vulnerabilities and the exploits of vulnerabilities are covered by any part of this document.
On the contrary, actually, the people that drafted this language in the UK government have explicitly told us that this is intended not to be covered in terms of the actual.
But I have to say that the only example of behavior that we've seen change is a vulnerability company. So, the intention isn't part of the.
But they know more about their business model and the way that their business model, precisely because this is an unregulated market. This does more than make the lives or business of a couple of companies hard. What this puts into place is transparency or an accountability to at least some third party on the behaviors of companies that have been previously unregulated. This puts into place potential criminal and legal damages for violations of these. This puts into place a relationship with human rights accountability practices and conversations, things like the State Department's annual human rights reports, for better or for worse, all of a sudden become a part of the conversation around these. This means that the provision of things like FinSpy involve DRL, potentially involve civil society, the Human Rights Division of the State Department. So this doesn't just make actually their businesses maybe have a few less customers. This in fact puts into place mechanisms of accountability that don't exist right now.
So I think just to talk to the question was like, well, okay, if we have if what we want to do is introduce systems of responsibility, what alternatives are there if this has issues with it? And I mean, just because I should at least take my moderator hat off and put on my EFF bearer. I mean, definitely one of the things to include in this is the case that you talked about, where we're actually suing the Ethiopian government for conducting essentially surveillance on US soil. And of course, that's a particular subset of behaviors. But the other part of this, I think, that's worth noting is that the border is a very interesting place to try and introduce these controls. I mean, certainly what we're talking about is people producing surveillance and intrusion equipment within certain countries. And there's an entire world of regulation that can exist within those places. And of course, it's not touching the development of intrusion and surveillance equipment and software within the countries that I think we're presumably talking about, which is being used for repressive purposes. So, I'll throw this open for other alternatives, right? But I mean, this is limited in itself, and I do think that there are other alternatives.
The Syrians, for example, they don't need a hacking team for getting.
But they did need blue code.
Yeah, but the specialist team don't even need that.
Sure, but there's a difference between something that is, Morgan brought this up actually on Monday, there's a difference between what's sophisticated and what's effective. And you can't do anything against a dozen people who are just creative and up against it. But there's a difference between what the Syrians are doing and what things like the Ethiopian government has promised. The Syrians are being persistent and being aggressive and have a few tricks. But what hacking team sells to Ethiopia is the promise that a particular device, no matter what the device is, will be compromised because a professional team of people is backing the compromising control of that device. We're not talking about the exploitation. We're talking about a massive infrastructure. We're not talking about the means of exploitation. We're talking about the infrastructure for controlling, administering, and eventually exfiltrating the data from that device.
And this is something which I find very interesting, because this is not what's inside the national agreement. Because what we are talking about is specifically like the service they provide for, large scale exploitation.
It isn't.
Okay, it's not how I read it, it's not how the lawyers I talk to read it. And they are all dealing with export controls. they are actually the lawless people.
So I'm going to close that off because I don't think that's resolvable, and then pass over here, and I'll pass over to Ben, who's been an academic working in this.
Sure. So just to respond first of all to the question that was over here, which I think is very important. For all of the conversation about export controls, they're a small part of the overall conversation, and they can't be the only or even the main form of leverage. So, like the litigations going on in EFF or Ethiopia, there's numerous other avenues.
OSCE complaints.
So the other CP complaint system, it's, I mean, you know, they're desperate, there's nothing there, that's why they're going
Right, I
to
agree. The OSCE complaint shows weakness in the legal system that we have to call companies to account for this. But let's also be honest about why this customer agreement was even put in place. This agreement, in its current language, was put in place because governments were sued to stand up to their human rights obligations. That's the reason we're having this conversation. Governments were sued, they were told, what the fuck are you doing about human rights, why are you letting this happen? And they had to respond, and they responded in this manner. So we can spend all day discussing what's actually in the terms, and even more complicated than that, what people will interpret that to be. Because I think the interpretation is likely. People can have many different kinds of interpretation. Of course, there will be collateral damage on both sides. I don't so much agree with Colin's very legalistic approach, because at the end of the day, what people believe is in the regulation is what the regulation comes to be. So we need to be extremely careful to ensure that the right people are affected by it and the wrong people aren't affected by it. That doesn't mean that there aren't other forms of leverage, precisely because governments, which are bound by their international human rights obligations, are part of this industry and part of this market. And in a sense, it's more of a sort of there's a lot of historic baggage in all of this, in the sense that we say we won the crypto wars, and to be honest, we may have just about got a nice amendment to them in the US at an international level. They were never won. We were lucky in that how they played out, and that was a nice thing. In the same way that the security industry over a period of time has evolved, and that has included some bad actors. And now we're faced with how to deal with the fact that Hack and Team and Finn Fisher are causing people to be locked up and tortured. And that's just a sort of a fact of life that governments will be asked to deal with. There will be lots of other solutions other than export controls. They will also be important. But just sort of assuming that the very bureaucratic language of this, which is at the end of the day just a boring bureaucratic process, will somehow make that go away is also naive. So it's one step in the human rights obligation that states have. And at least I can only speak to Germany, in the German case, the penalties aren't particularly interesting. There's not even criminal penalties involved. You can get fined for education. It's like this is a slow, bureaucratic, boring process that isn't
Actually, it's not right. If you export without the proper paper, you can get into trouble.
You can get into trouble for sure.
As long as you don't sell ships and guns.
Exactly, but this is the thing. And so specifically the language of this thing, for the most part we're talking about a very boring bureaucratic process. But precisely because people who do security software are so concerned about this, and they're concerned possibly legitimately because they've been screwed by the government so often in the past. It's totally, it's not like somehow that this is some random concern. We've got to be even harder to ensure that people are fully clear about what the potential negative consequences of this are, because they have seen the NSA documents and they have great experience of dealing with asshole governments.
My argument for legalism, just to be clear, is not about trust in the wording of a document, but about the level of engagement and the type of engagement you have. And so what I'm saying is that there's a difference between an engagement in a legal document and a legal process, and sort of this emotional mechanism that we've had so far. All of the things that you said are valid, are what I agree with. And I want to make that clear. This is one avenue amongst many, including lawsuits, including complaints. We are desperate. These are all desperate moves. But we don't have any other option if we think that there should be, if the democratic process and the human rights process, is to exist with regard to these technologies.
Yeah, but what I find a little bit weird is that it's all so detached from the main problem we have, and the main problem is insecurity.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to go using my power as moderator. I mean, one thing I just want to add to that is one thing that we were talking about is that in the recent UW versus Cisco case that was thrown out, which seemed interesting, and one of the things that the judge used was this argument that if what Cisco was doing was so bad, there would be export controls on it. And I think this is doubly worrying, right? That this is an interrelation between what we might try to do here in a limited way and what we try to do in other avenues, and how those things interrelate. And maybe it's an argument for introducing even stronger export controls, but maybe it's also an argument for saying, look, these cannot be the be-all and end-all of this, that this isn't what this is intended to do. So, sorry.
If you just mentioned Cisco, because I'm a shareholder and I have two proposals to Cisco committee, and I have a lot of time engaged with Cisco.
Right.
So that's particularly because when we talk about the export Taiwan massacre, the student, the constitutional value there. So basically the law is still there. After the Taiwan massacre, the U.S. Congress has law. The private last reason is Cisco complains why they only come to be a certain company. Every company have doing the same thing. So that's actually the Taiwan art. It's another the value. So that's the whole the business with this. And now differently is that for example, now when we talk about the previously the thing about the export control like machine, the communication facility, but now it's the software. And now we come to another way, another direction, like import control. For example, China's WeChat, they have 300 million users, and not like we Chinese people in America, we use WeChat. And now we find out the censorship. So that's like the Chinese people really back to the America, to the world, and nobody is like chat or censorship, how to argue with that. So maybe when like Alibaba or they come to America to list the US stock, and that's the way we can buy a project, purchase their stock, and then the shareholder to talk to engage with like the Chinese company they come to America. So this is another way that called like import control.
Right. So the argument here is this idea that rather than just preventing things going out, there are always going to be globalization.
There's two ways.
Right. There'll be something here that you can impose controls on.
I wanted to pick up some of the elements that I think this discussion has done to reveal and I think put on the table. And I want to echo what Ben pointed out and what Howie pointed out in terms of the underlying problem being that we have insecure technologies. And I think if you look at the general effort that has gone into making systems more secure in the past years, this has been the weakest link in many countries in terms of hardening the systems and trying to actually do that. So I think that can go a long way. At the same time, I think there is a caveat to that the coders in the room will know that if even any effort to try to build more secure technologies can only go so far, and 100% secure technology is not really possible, that you'll always have some sort of flaw that will be built into the software code in and of itself.
Or usually it's just the user.
Or the user, which is and I think this goes back to the argument, it's not really an either or. I think it needs to be a parallel process so that we can raise the bar to make surveillance a lot more, not only harder, but also more costly for whoever wants to do that. At the same time, I think the securing technology in and of itself won't solve that problem, and it won't get rid of the problem that we're currently facing of Western companies exporting these technologies to governments and to countries where we know that people are not only having their privacy invaded, but end up in jail and potentially be tortured down the road. I think a key difference to the crypto war experience in the 1990s is a difference in interest from the government side. In the 1990s, it was clear, especially in the US context, that crypto controls were considered to be munitions, and the government had an active interest in trying to control it and to view the individual hacker or individual, like private actors, as the bad actor. So it was very much this fight between the government and people that are security researchers. I think as we've been looking into this for the past year and a half, I would argue there's actually a change in the situation we are finding ourselves in right now, because the government is actually not the one who's trying to defend this technology, because they're not the ones who are making a profit out of it. So I think that the constellation of interests from the government side is different from the 1990s, in that the government actually has an interest in making sure that the way this language is being implemented doesn't have unintended consequences. And I think to make an empirical example, all of you are reading the news and will come across the cybersecurity latest news or the new bill or something needs to happen to avoid cyber war or whatever. I would actually make the argument that the government has a very active interest to make sure that security researchers aren't impacted by this very language, because they are interested in making sure that cybersecurity is being addressed, because they face currently huge problems in that area and don't have the means to actually do that, and are dependent on these security professionals to help mitigate this problem. And the last point that I wanted to make was is something else that Fukami mentioned in terms of the Wassenaar regime and whether it's an appropriate forum. I think this is the type of question or issue that we need to focus on more and break down this debate from a very ideological, are export controls good or bad, and looking more at the pragmatic, like what does the language look like and what is the appropriate regime? Because I think there are many people that actually agree with you that Wassenaar has morphed over time. It's no longer what it was developed to do. Encryption is one example of what was initially considered to be munition, but it's now part of the dual use list. And there are other examples of like chemicals that are somehow part of the...
What's the dual use of encryption? It's something I don't understand.
And I think, but that becomes a different debate. That becomes a debate of do we need a new regime entirely, where you would take out the encryption controls out of Wassenaar and would put it under a new regime, where something like surveillance technology could become part of it as well. And it's a broader discussion about what kind of institutional mechanisms should be the avenue to address that. And I think that's a very legitimate question of, do we actually want to keep this in a framework that came out of the Cold War and that had a focus on munitions or not? And I think these are the kind of questions where it comes to the implementation, and this goes back to this agreement. What Colin pointed out in terms of level of engagement, there are avenues that haven't been fully exploited yet in terms of the technical advisory committees, looking at the actual language and submitting letters in terms of here are our concerns, very legitimate concerns of how could this affect security researchers and what needs to be taken into account, because this language isn't a done deal. This is right now being looked at from the government side in trying to implement this through licensing policy, trying to determine what kind of end users would the export of this technology require a license for. So a lot of these concerns can actually become integrated into the implementation process, and by issuance of frequently asked questions, clarifications from the government side, to very much integrate the concerns that we have, and to potentially counter some statements from other actors or companies that are trying to already frame this implementation in a very different way. And whoever wants to engage with that, please come up with that.
But one thing on the government, I mean, I don't think that you said they have an interest in protecting the security people on one hand, on the other hand, that they don't have an interest to export those technology. The weird thing is, as I said, this what we have here is exactly what's recommended by, for example, the ETSI standard. Exactly what's in here. So that shows very clearly that something is awkward. You don't need to know much more than just this little fact.
The NC's law firm is.
Yeah, and another thing, like security researchers are a big danger for companies and also for the state. And I always recognize that when we, for example, give us an e-passport or something like that, that the way we get attacked, the way they, how they even if we have a much better way of dealing with like hackers in public in Germany, because they are somewhat different than in the US, for example. So they are not only criminals in Germany, they are also some sort of heroes. So still, there is, or at least I recognize that there is a way to frame it that those people doing security are always the bad persons, no matter what they do. And to only include to frame the good people as those people who work for law enforcement needs. And this is a very, very weird situation. It is different than 10 years ago, but even worse from my point of view.
So I think we've run out of time, but I think that the conclusion that I think everybody can agree to is that we really need to keep an eye on this. I think that more involvement is important. important. And I think one of the points that we can also point out is that actually somebody said to me, you know, okay, what's the calculus here? That this is something that will protect human rights in certain countries, and the people who are worried about it are a small group of people, a small group of technologists. And I mean, I would like to point out that that small group of technologists are the people who are actually detecting and working and fighting this. So I think that even though there's two sides to a debate here, we have to pay attention to both groups, because as we've all agreed that, you know, defending and increasing security is the only long-term solution to this. And the vulnerable group on one side of this, or at least the people most concerned about their vulnerability, are going to be the people who will improve that security. So it's a really great debate. I hope you continue to follow what all of our panelists are writing on this, and take this piece of paper away and start scribbling on it and send it up.